In the spring of 1847, the small town of Millbrook, Kentucky was still finding its rhythm in a post-frontier world. Nestled between low-lying hills and dense woods, the town offered few attractions beyond its stillness. Farmers worked the land from sunup to sundown, and the dusty main road saw more cattle than carriages. But for all its simplicity, Millbrook was on a route frequented by tradesmen, drifters, and families moving westward, many of them in search of new beginnings, and all in need of places to rest along the way. It was around this time that two women arrived in town. Eliza Cunningham, aged 34, and her younger sister Ruth, 29, stepped down from a worn coach one mild April afternoon, their arrival quiet yet not unnoticed. To the townsfolk, they looked refined, Eliza with her deliberate posture and somber eyes, and Ruth with a soft smile and a confidence uncommon in women traveling alone. Rumors swirled almost immediately. Some said they were widows from Charleston, others whispered of inheritance money. The truth was that no one really knew where they had come from. What was known is that within a matter of weeks, they had purchased a large, empty house at the edge of town and began renovations. The property had once belonged to a retired physician and was known to be one of the more prominent structures in Millbrook. It was a two-story building with a broad front porch, tall windows, and a long view of the road that wound its way from the east. By early summer, the transformation was complete. A hand-carved sign reading Millbrook Inn hung from a wrought iron bracket above the door. White curtains fluttered behind the windows. The air around the house was scented with bread, herbs, and wood smoke. Locals watched with curiosity, some with suspicion, but many with admiration for the sisters' quiet determination. The Cunninghams introduced themselves in town with grace and humility. They attended church, visited the market, and made charitable donations to the small schoolhouse fund. Eliza was more reserved, often keeping to the business side of things, registering supplies, managing accounts, and hiring help when necessary. Ruth, on the other hand, took to the social role with ease. She conversed effortlessly with visitors, remembered names, and offered meals to the poor. The sisters quickly became known for their generosity, particularly to strangers. They offered warm rooms, home-cooked meals, and gentle conversation to travelers who stopped by the inn. It wasn't long before the Millbrook Inn developed a reputation as a haven of comfort. The townspeople were grateful for the new establishment. With few accommodations in the area, Millbrook Inn filled a genuine need. Visitors wrote glowing letters and spoke of the inn as a hidden gem of Kentucky. They praised the clean sheets, the roasted venison stew, and the way the fire was always burning warmly when they arrived. Some travelers stayed a single night, others lingered for days, charmed by the quiet hospitality that seemed to surround the place like a soft fog. Though the sisters rarely spoke of their past, the mystery of their origin became part of their allure. Ruth, when pressed by curious guests, would only say that they had come seeking a quieter life, far from pain. Eliza never commented. The sisters shared a room on the second floor, and according to those who worked at the inn, they spent long evenings together in silence, reading, sewing, or simply sitting by the fire. A few of the town's older residents muttered about how two women, unescorted and unmarried, could thrive in a town like Millbrook without trouble. But their behavior was impeccable. They paid wages on time, treated townsfolk with respect, and gave no cause for alarm. They were even known to take in sick travelers and nurse them back to health, though, curiously, no one ever seemed to recall those patients returning to town. The inn's guest book filled steadily. Carriages rolled in from every direction, and weary travelers spoke of being drawn to the place by word of mouth alone. Businessmen, gamblers, fur trappers, even Union scouts on unofficial routes came and went. But somewhere along the way, patterns began to emerge, subtle, slow, and easy to dismiss at first. A merchant's son never returned from his journey west. A peddler failed to meet his family in Louisville. A pair of German immigrants vanished between towns, last seen on the road that led past the Millbrook Inn. But in 1847, these were still coincidences, not causes for concern. The sisters smiled, served their tea, and the town went about its business, unaware of what lay beneath the manicured grounds behind the house. Eliza and Ruth Cunningham were unlike any women Millbrook had ever known. In a town where most women were tied to marriage, child-rearing, or domestic service, the sisters stood apart with a peculiar blend of independence and grace. Their charm did not scream for attention, it crept in slowly, disarming visitors and neighbors alike. They spoke with precision, listened more than they talked, and carried themselves with a quiet dignity that made even the skeptical lean in closer when they spoke. Eliza, the elder by 5 years, was the more austere of the two. She moved through the inn like a shadow, calm, collected, and always observing. Her dark hair was always tied back neatly, and her attire was practical yet elegant, usually in muted tones of gray or burgundy. She handled the inn's books with the precision of a banker and rarely displayed emotion beyond a polite nod or subtle smile. To the staff, she was firm but never cruel. To the townspeople, she was a mystery, someone who could run a successful business without ever fully inviting the world in. Ruth was the opposite in many ways. Where Eliza observed, Ruth engaged. She was warm, approachable, and often the first face a traveler would see upon arrival. With her honey-colored hair always pinned in a loose bun and her eyes full of softness, she had an uncanny ability to make guests feel like old friends. She laughed easily, often served the meals herself, and remembered every detail a guest shared: birthdays, favorite wines, tales from the road. Visitors spoke of her voice as melodic, her touch comforting, and her gaze reassuring. She made people feel safe, even those who had spent years living without it. The dynamic between the sisters was seamless. While Eliza handled the logistics and structural upkeep of the inn, Ruth focused on the human element. She chose the fabric for the linens, decorated each guest room with fresh flowers, and ensured there was always a warm fire in the parlor. Ruth often wrote the letters that were sent on behalf of illiterate travelers, and many swore she had a way with words that bordered on poetry. She was known to sing quietly in the evenings as she swept the entryway or arranged books on the shelves of the inn's modest reading room. Their kindness extended well beyond the walls of the inn. They made weekly donations to the local orphanage and even offered a room to a widowed schoolteacher after her home burned down. Every holiday, the Cunninghams prepared hot meals for drifters who had nowhere to go, feeding them without expectation. If a guest came to the inn short on funds, they were never turned away. Ruth would say, "Comfort comes before coin," and no one who stayed under their roof ever felt judged for their circumstances. Their generosity became folklore in itself. Yet their kindness was always balanced with control. Guests at the inn, while treated with warmth, were expected to abide by the house's quiet order. No loud voices after sundown. No drunkenness. No uninvited entry into the kitchen or cellar. Rules were explained gently but firmly, usually by Eliza, and rarely broken. If someone did challenge the sisters' quiet authority, they were never thrown out, but they never stayed more than one night. More often than not, they left with the impression that while the inn was inviting, it was not to be disrespected. Women in town would often remark on the sisters' closeness. They were seen walking together in the mornings, gathering herbs from the wooded path behind the inn, or sitting on the porch at twilight, sharing a pot of tea without exchanging a single word. No suitors ever came calling, and none were ever entertained. When asked about love or marriage, Ruth would smile and say, "We've already given our hearts away, to the road and those who travel it." Eliza would not answer at all. Their bond seemed untouchable, forged by something deeper than blood or necessity. To those on the outside, it was hard to tell who led whom, or if they even needed to be led at all. Guests often spoke of feeling watched at the inn, but not in an unsettling way. Rather, it was the sense of being cared for, even when alone. A missing glove would be returned before it was even noticed lost. A traveler with a cough would find warm tonic waiting outside their door before dawn. The sisters always seemed to know what was needed, and when. Some believed it was intuition, others thought it was simply the mark of excellent hospitality. A few, much later, would wonder if it was something else entirely. As the reputation of the Millbrook Inn grew, so did the number of travelers who passed through its doors. The inn became a popular waypoint for merchants, tradesmen, wanderers, and occasionally entire families making their way westward. It offered far more than a meal and a bed, it offered respite. Word spread through Kentucky and beyond that the Cunningham sisters provided something rare, not just comfort, but care. Many described the experience as if the inn could somehow anticipate a traveler's needs before they were even spoken. In a world hardened by loss and distance, that kind of welcome was invaluable. But as more guests came through Millbrook, something else began to shift, something more subtle than a missing item or an unanswered letter, but unsettling nonetheless. It started with quiet absences that were difficult to piece together in a world that moved slowly and communicated less. A peddler from Tennessee, known for traveling with a blue cart and a friendly beagle, was last seen entering the inn late one autumn evening. His dog was later found wandering near the banks of the Millbrook Creek, but the man himself was never heard from again. At the time, no one thought to question the coincidence. Travelers went missing often in those days, caught in storms, ambushed by highwaymen, or simply swept away by the perils of wilderness. Then came the letter from a family in Cincinnati, inquiring about a young couple who had written from Millbrook 2 weeks earlier, promising to return by month's end. They had never arrived. The letter was passed around the churchyard and eventually brought to Eliza Cunningham, who responded with calm regret. She remembered the couple, she said, they had stayed 2 nights, then set off toward Frankfort. She could offer no further information. The matter was dropped. After all, people had a way of vanishing on the road. Most assumed the sisters had done what they could. Yet, over time, these absences began to form a pattern, though not one easily noticed. The disappearances were intermittent, rarely discussed, and spaced out enough that even the local constable failed to connect them. But among the servants and staff at the inn, quiet whispers began to grow. A stable boy claimed he had seen a traveler's horse still tied behind the inn days after the man was supposed to have left. A chambermaid noted that certain rooms were cleaned less frequently than others, not because they were unoccupied, but because no one was allowed in them. One girl, hired briefly to help in the kitchen, said she saw Eliza carrying something heavy wrapped in cloth out toward the woods one morning before dawn. She quit the next day, claiming, something about that place listens when it should be sleeping. The local doctor, an aging man named Horace Bell, began to take note. He had treated Ruth once for a minor burn and remarked on the strange aroma that lingered on her clothing, an odd blend of lavender, bloodroot, and something metallic he couldn't place. When a young man from Paducah disappeared after a week-long stay, Bell asked questions around town. Most responded with shrugs, uneasy smiles, or pointed reminders that the Cunninghams were good women, kind women, who helped more than they ever harmed. His inquiries went nowhere. Even the mail carrier began to grow suspicious. He noted that certain guests received letters at the inn, letters which remained uncollected long after the recipients were supposedly gone. In one instance, he delivered a parcel addressed to a Mr. J. Hamilton, who had checked into the Millbrook Inn 3 days earlier. The sisters accepted the package and told the carrier that Mr. Hamilton had departed early. The mailman left, but not before noticing that the guest's name was still written in chalk on the small board that hung behind the front desk, marking room assignments. It was gone the next day. Of course, none of these incidents amounted to proof. The town was small, and the sisters had become beloved figures. Questioning them meant questioning the comforting illusion they had built, a place of gentility in a brutal world. Most locals simply didn't want to believe that something dark could be happening behind those white curtains and flower boxes. It was easier to assume bad luck, poor weather, or bandits on the road. It was easier to trust the smiles and the sweetbread than to imagine a darker truth. And so the disappearances remained unexplained, their connections hidden beneath layers of courtesy, denial, and charm. The land behind the Millbrook Inn was quiet, shrouded in soft grass and framed by a sparse line of trees that led into the woods. A narrow trail wound its way between flowering shrubs and broken stones, a path that many assumed was simply an old wagon route or a place for guests to stroll in peace. It wasn't unusual to see Ruth Cunningham there at dawn, apron still tied, her hands clasped behind her back as she walked in slow circles. To passing eyes, she looked like a woman enjoying the calm of early morning, perhaps lost in prayer or memory. No one thought to question what might lie beyond that rise in the earth just beyond the hedges. No one had reason to. That changed in the fall of 1850, when a group of boys wandered too far during a game of chase. They had been climbing trees near the creek when one of them, 8-year-old Matthew Vines, stumbled on something sticking out from the dirt. At first, he thought it was a tree root. But as he kicked away the leaves and earth, what emerged was unmistakably human, a length of bone, pale and smooth, its rounded end exposed to the air like a warning finger. The boys ran screaming back to town, their game forgotten. What followed was slow at first. Sheriff Edwin Croft, a man known more for breaking up bar fights than handling matters of real consequence, rode out to the site that afternoon. The bone was indeed human. He marked the area and returned with 2 townsmen and a spade. By nightfall, they had uncovered 2 full skeletons, laid side by side in shallow graves no more than 2 feet deep. There were no coffins, no markings, and nothing to identify them beyond the remnants of a rusted belt buckle and a woman's shoe buckle. Croft ordered the area roped off. Word spread fast through Millbrook, and by morning a crowd had gathered outside the inn, watching with silent anticipation as more digging began. Over the next 3 days, the number of bodies unearthed climbed rapidly. They were not organized in any logical fashion, some were stacked, others laid out with care. Some were male, others female. A few were no more than children. Many still bore fragments of clothing, shredded and rotted, buttons and lace tangled among roots. Some skulls showed fractures. Others were pristine. By the end of the week, the count had reached 43. The discovery stunned the town into a state of numb disbelief. The gentle sisters who baked pies for the poor, who cared for sick strangers, who read aloud to orphans at the holidays, were now the center of what had become the largest mass grave ever discovered in that region of Kentucky. The inn, once a place of comfort, was now treated like something diseased. Townspeople crossed the street to avoid it. Horses balked when led near its gates. The guests who had been staying there left in haste, abandoning luggage and unpaid tabs in their rush to leave something that suddenly felt cursed. When questioned, Eliza remained calm. She acknowledged the graves but denied any knowledge of them. She explained that the land had been purchased as is and that the sisters had never disturbed the rear acreage. Ruth wept during her questioning, clutching a handkerchief and speaking in a voice barely above a whisper. She said they had cared for the land as best they could and had never seen anything that would suggest bodies were buried there. She blamed the previous owners, vagabonds, perhaps even old war dead. Croft found no immediate evidence to contradict their claims. But as the bodies were examined more closely, doubts began to mount. A few of the deceased were identified by trinkets, jewelry, or personal items, some of which had been listed in missing persons notices from nearby towns. One was a traveling watchmaker from Bardstown, another a German girl who had written to her family from Millbrook weeks before vanishing. Patterns began to emerge. Most of the bodies bore no wounds that indicated violent death, but some showed signs of blunt trauma to the skull or ribs. A few had traces of arsenic in the bone marrow, consistent with slow poisoning over time. The cellar of the inn was searched next. It was a cold, stone-walled chamber, lined with jars and crates. Hidden behind a false wall, the sheriff's men found what appeared to be a guest ledger different from the one kept at the front desk. This ledger contained names and dates, some with small excess marked next to them. The handwriting was not Ruth's. It was Eliza's. Further searches turned up clothing, jewelry, and even travel documents belonging to people presumed to have left Millbrook years ago. Still, no one had seen the sisters commit any crime. No eyewitness had ever come forward. There were no surviving victims. All that remained were bones, rumors, and a town struggling to reconcile what it had found with what it thought it knew. The 43 graves behind the inn told their story in silence, row after row of unanswered questions buried in dirt and disbelief. The trial of Eliza and Ruth Cunningham began in the spring of 1851, nearly a year after the discovery of the graves behind the Millbrook Inn. It took months for the authorities to piece together enough evidence, secure witnesses, and quiet the uproar that had gripped not just Millbrook, but neighboring towns as well. The sisters had been placed under house arrest while the investigation unfolded, a decision that drew sharp criticism from some who believed they should have been locked away immediately. But despite the horrors uncovered, the law had to move carefully. There were no witnesses to any acts of violence, and the evidence, though deeply unsettling, remained circumstantial. The courtroom was packed on the first day of proceedings. Reporters, townspeople, and travelers who had once passed through the inn filled the benches and aisles. A heavy silence blanketed the room as Eliza and Ruth were led in, dressed in black and flanked by 2 deputies. Eliza's expression remained unreadable, her gaze fixed forward. Ruth looked pale, her eyes downcast, clutching a lace handkerchief with trembling fingers. The room watched them as if trying to decide whether to believe the smiling hosts of yesterday or the silent figures accused of mass murder. The prosecution began by painting a picture of deliberate deception. They detailed the timeline of disappearances, linking names from the hidden ledger with those buried behind the inn. They brought in forensic experts from Louisville, who testified about the arsenic traces found in several remains, the unnatural positioning of some of the bodies, and the unlikelihood that so many deaths occurred naturally in the same location over just a few years. They presented letters from families who had lost loved ones, letters dated, emotional, and eerily consistent in describing the last known location of the missing, the Millbrook Inn. Testimony from former employees of the inn played a central role in the trial. A chambermaid named Clara Dent described being forbidden to enter certain rooms and being dismissed abruptly after questioning the sisters about a missing traveler's belongings. A cook recalled finding a small pouch of white powder in the pantry, one that disappeared the next day when she mentioned it to Ruth. A stable hand testified that he had once seen Eliza leading a horse into the woods late at night and returning without it, or its rider. Each testimony added another thread to the web, tightening around the sisters in quiet increments. The defense, meanwhile, leaned heavily on the sisters' reputation and the lack of direct proof. Their attorney, a methodical man from Lexington named Howard Pike, argued that the sisters had become victims of small-town hysteria and rumor. He reminded the jury that Kentucky had seen its share of violence, of wayward travelers and wild roads, and that the presence of bodies did not mean guilt. He emphasized the charity of the Cunninghams, the lack of any financial motive, and the absence of eyewitnesses. He suggested that the graves could have been from another time, perhaps related to illness, war, or misfortune that predated the sisters' ownership of the land. Character witnesses came forward to speak in the sisters' favor. A preacher described their regular donations to the church. A schoolteacher praised their intelligence and compassion. A widow wept as she recalled how Ruth had nursed her child through a fever while others turned them away. These testimonies left the courtroom in a state of moral tension, pulled between horror and memory, between the women people thought they knew and the monstrous story unfolding before them. Eliza took the stand only once. Her voice was steady, her answers brief and exact. She denied any knowledge of the deaths, claimed the ledger was merely a record of travelers who had overstayed or paid in full, and dismissed the discovery of the hidden room as coincidence. When asked directly about the 43 graves, she responded that she could not speak for what had happened before their arrival in Millbrook and that the land had never been fully surveyed by them. Ruth was deemed too unwell to testify. A physician stated that she had taken ill with nerves and grief, and her testimony was excused. As the trial wore on, public sentiment began to fracture. Some still believed in the sisters' innocence, convinced that 2 women so dignified and graceful could never commit such acts. Others became certain of their guilt, seeing the trial not as a question of evidence but of evil hiding in plain sight. The jury deliberated for 3 days, struggling under the weight of conflicting testimony, emotional appeals, and a haunting lack of final proof. There was no murder weapon, no confession, and no direct witness to what had happened inside the walls of the Millbrook Inn. Only the silence of the dead and the sharp contrast between the faces people had trusted and the evidence unearthed beneath the soil. Long after the trial ended and the doors of the Millbrook Inn were shuttered, the memory of the Cunningham sisters lingered in Kentucky like smoke that never quite clears. The verdict, whatever it was, did little to resolve the tension that had taken root in Millbrook. For some, justice had been served; for others, the mystery only deepened. The sisters had entered the town as enigmas, and they left it the same way. The house remained standing for several years, its shutters drawn, its garden overgrown. Children dared each other to touch the front gate, and travelers whispered as they passed by, unsure if they were seeing a piece of history or something still alive in shadow. Stories began to blossom almost immediately, first in the taverns and parlors of Millbrook, then in neighboring towns, and eventually across the state. No two versions were quite the same. Some said the sisters had made a pact with something unholy, offering souls in exchange for beauty or power. Others claimed the inn sat atop cursed land, and that Eliza and Ruth had merely been tools in a larger, darker purpose. There were even those who believed the sisters had been innocent all along, framed by locals who couldn't accept the idea of 2 unmarried women thriving without male oversight. These tales changed with each telling, but all agreed on one point: something had happened at the Millbrook Inn, and no one would ever truly understand what it was. People reported seeing candlelight in the upper windows long after the house was empty. A few said they heard singing at dusk, a soft lullaby drifting across the fields when the wind was just right. Travelers who stopped near the property claimed to feel watched, as if eyes behind lace curtains were still tracking their every move. One man swore he saw Ruth herself, walking barefoot through the back garden, her hair loose and her dress soaked to the hem as though she had come from the creek. When he called out, she vanished without a trace. The graves were eventually marked with a shared monument, a large slab of stone etched with the simple phrase, "In memory of the unknown." 43 names were never carved because most were never identified. Family members came from distant places to lay flowers, many not even sure if their loved ones had truly been among the dead. They wept over possibilities, over unanswered letters and empty chairs at dinner tables, and for some, the site became a place of closure. For others, it was just another wound. The inn became the subject of ghost stories and regional lore. Writers and folklorists made pilgrimages to Millbrook, collecting tales from old-timers who remembered the trial, or claimed their grandparents had known the sisters. A few books were written, some factual, some wildly imaginative, each trying to piece together the fragmented truth. One described Eliza as a Southern Medea, a woman driven to murder out of some twisted sense of love or vengeance. Another framed Ruth as the true villain, using her charm to lure victims into trusting her, while Eliza merely protected her. Theories multiplied: poison in the food, traps in the cellar, a secret society meeting in the woods behind the house. None were proven, all were believed by someone. In time, the inn was sold at auction. Several buyers backed out after visiting the property. One claimed his dog refused to enter the threshold and howled until it was led away. Another said he found a small book lodged between floorboards in the upstairs hall, a ledger with only dates, no names, and the last entry reading simply, April 7th. Rain coming. The book was never seen again. Eventually, the building fell into disrepair. Its roof sagged, its foundation cracked, and the vines crept up over the porch and into the windows. A fire destroyed what remained in 1874, a blaze of unknown origin that left only the brick chimney standing. Some said lightning struck it. Others claimed the land itself finally rejected the weight of so much silence. Today, the site where the Millbrook Inn once stood is just a field bordered by a sagging fence and a cluster of black locust trees. But even now, people leave offerings there: flowers, candles, coins. Paranormal investigators have been known to visit, drawn by tales of cold spots and ghostly whispers. Local teachers still warn children not to wander too far along the old trail behind the property. And every so often, someone will claim to have seen two women standing at the edge of the woods, their outlines sharp against the morning mist, watching, waiting, together in the stillness just before sunrise. 5.